Go ahead and start recording, please. Thank you, Tristan. And by the way, right before I start, can I just have all of you join me in an extraordinary shout out and thank you to Tristan. Since the midterm, he has graciously recorded all of the lectures. He has placed them on the YouTube, listen to me, on the internets, on the YouTube. I'm such an idiot. He's put it on YouTube for you and for us. So please, everybody, just give him a big thank you, big fist pump, a big thank you. We love you, Tristan. Really, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Tristan.
Yay, Tristan. Thank you.
There's the community love. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. And a few announcements, and we will finish chapter 2. So the first announcement is, again, sorry, but the final is due a week from this Thursday, May 14th, okay, by 3 p.m. Email it to me by 3 p.m. Your time, Pacific Standard Time, okay? And I assume all of you have the prompt, is that right? Good. So the prompt has the date and time, the instructions, and the question. So you should have everything you need to write the final and the instructions. In addition, as we just said, all the lectures from Mill to next Thursday's, from Rorty to Thursday's lecture, all the lectures directly relevant to the final have been recorded. They're on YouTube. So if you missed, they're available. I know listening to me over and over has got to be kind of like a special level of Dante's hell. I'm sorry about that, but at least it's there for you and you can access it. Okay, so the YouTube lectures are available for you. We've walked through every chapter, every idea. I sent you the lecture notes. And so you should be in great shape. This final should be a no-brainer. Pour yourself a little glass of whiskey and put the kids to sleep, or put some jazz on and hammer this out. It should be no problem. All right. And so the last announcement, I'm very sorry. I will not be able to send you my lecture notes for chapter 3. It just didn't happen. There's a kind of avalanche of things happening, end of semester kind of stuff happening, and it just didn't happen. So we'll have a whole lecture on chapter 3, and by the time we get to it, you should be very familiar with Mill's ideas, how he's using the term contingency, and how he will want to apply it to liberal democracy. So it should be very accessible to you, but I won't be able to send them to you, so I apologize for that. Otherwise, we're going to finish chapter 2 today. We got a very leisurely schedule or agenda today. We're going to finish chapter 2, talk about some really critically important ideas in chapter 2 and in the whole argument in general. And then on Thursday, we will have an entire lecture on chapter 3, the contingency of liberal democracy, or what he calls the contingency of the community. All right, so any questions? Everybody all right? You ready to go?
Yep,
Will we get an outline for chapter 3, Professor?
I'll see. I'll try. I will try. Let me try. I can't promise you anything. I'm participating in an international conference tomorrow that's being organized out of Anglo-American University in Prague. And it's an international conference on the world after COVID-19, on the politics, the economics, the geopolitics. So literally tomorrow I'm in that for several hours. And then I've got various groups that I have to talk to after that. So I will try to type something up at least tomorrow as an outline, but there's no promises. Okay.
Sure, thank you, Professor.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, never enough, is it, for you?
Rorty's a hard one. Rorty was really difficult for me.
I don't believe it. You guys are geniuses. I don't believe it. All right, are we ready to go?
Yep.
We're going to pick up where we picked up. We're going to pick up where we left off last Thursday. And I want to move through some passages and interpret them, place them in the broader argument, and relate them to the final exam question, so you know how to relate Rorty's ideas to the specific ideas we're asking. And specifically, how does Rorty sort of radicalize Mill, make Mill postmodern, and how does Rorty make Nietzsche amenable to a democratic politics? So we're going to move through the ideas, always with the desire to do two things. One, kind of unpack the ideas, and then situate the ideas in the context of the questions that we're raising for the final. Okay, so you guys ready to go? All right, it's good to see you. I'm gonna miss you guys. All right, so let's pick up on page 28, the bottom of page 28. And Rorty is deepening this argument about the importance of becoming a strong poet. And for Nietzsche and for Rorty, this is the most important sort of, I would say, part of their thinking. For Rorty, the goal in life is to articulate as creative and an idiosyncratic, descriptive, private sense of oneself as humanly possible. Literally, what Rorty meant to create an I, and you create an I by sort of finding the emotional courage and the poetic energy and the poetic and intellectual energy to try to learn to describe yourself and your private life and your meaning and your values and purposes by stylizing or reappropriating words and ideas that already exist, or in more bold and profound ways, inventing your own words and your own descriptions and your own idiosyncratic ways of telling the poem of your life. And so Rorty is quite fascinated by that. It's what he calls a strong poet. He gets the word from Bloom, and Bloom gets it from Nietzsche. All right, and again, we left off on last Thursday with a rather intense discussion about the importance of disentangling yourself from the inherited descriptions, from the inherited metaphors, from the always already given language that we have inherited by the culture, by the family, by the ethnicity, by the racial groupings, by the socioeconomic groupings, whatever it might be, right? By this need to one, disentangle ourselves from those inherited languages, from those what Rorty would call vocabularies, and therefore from the inherited metaphors, and begin the process to redescribe lots and lots and lots of things, and especially redescribe lots of things in our private life. So Nietzsche goes on the bottom of 28. He says, only poets, again, these strong poets, these people who use words in new ways, who invent new words, who invent new descriptions, right? And again, we're talking about words here, but this can be music, this can be painting, there can be all sorts of tools that one can equip oneself with to do all sorts of redescription, all sorts of expression. And so Rorty writes at the bottom of page 28, only poets, Nietzsche supposed, can truly appreciate contingency, right? Who can truly appreciate this idea that language is a human invention, that it's a tool we use to do things. What do we do with it? We describe things. We describe these in very dense, powerful, deep, meaningful private lives. And we describe a space that we open up through words that we share with others, right? And that's a contingent notion of language, that it is a human invention, and it's a kind of an assertion of power. And then ultimately, it's undergoing radical change. It's undergoing constant transformation. And by the way, that's even an incredibly important part of this whole argument. The language is contingent. It's not just accidental in the sense that you and I, it's an accident where we find ourselves being born. The culture we find ourselves in, the parents we find ourselves, the race and the ethnicity and the tribal associations, right? That's not just contingent in the sense that it's an accident. It's random that we find ourselves there, right? But even more importantly, it's contingent in the sense that it's agonistic and it's in constant transformation, it's a constant change. In fact, Nietzsche and Rorty are trying to seduce us into seeing language as something that is unstable, that is highly mobile, that is contested, that is agonistic, because only if we see it as that and we embrace it as that will we be inspired to use it in new and creative and expressive and poetic ways, right? In fact, that's kind of the secret. Once you realize that language is a human invention, extraordinarily important invention, it's a tool. It allows us to describe things, and once we kind of own that, once we get familiar with that, then there's no limit. And Rorty means this quite sincerely. Well, there's death. Death is a limit, but as long as we're alive, there's no limit to the sort of creative, idiosyncratic, visionary, poetic, stylistic things we can do with words as tools, as descriptions, right? And in fact, that's the purpose of life, to become very profound and skilled and creative in the language that we invent to tell the story of our life, to tell the poem of our life, in and through which will come our meaning, our value, and our purpose. So this is what he's talking about, the bottom, page 28. Only poets, Nietzsche suspected, can truly appreciate the contingency, that language is contingent. And then he says, the rest of us are doomed, right? If we remain metaphysical, right? As he says, if we don't recognize the contingency of language, and if we're not empowered to seize it and bend it and arc it in our own visionary and idiosyncratic ways, right? If we don't become strong poets in this radical sense, he says the rest of us are doomed, he says, to remain philosophers, right? And what does that mean? He means to remain in some way metaphysically grounded, in the sense that there's some objective truth out there that we need to discover the right language, or we need to discover the right words that cohere with our minds and connect us to that, right? If we don't see language as contingent, we remain what he calls philosophers. We remain somehow metaphysical about the project. And he says, and if we do that, he says, the rest of us are doomed to remain philosophers, to insist that there is only one true vocabulary. He uses the word ladling list, but let's be very clear what he's talking about. If we don't recognize the contingency of language, right, and we remain committed to some metaphysical truth, right, he says we are doomed to remain philosophers, to insist that there is really only one true vocabulary, one true description of the human situation, one universal context of all our lives. We are doomed to spend our conscious lives, trying to escape from contingency, rather than, like the strong poet, acknowledging and appropriating contingency, right? And this is an extraordinarily beautiful description of the metaphysical postmodern tension. And not only is it a beautiful description, but we've already seen one very interesting description or account of this distinction, right? So let's look at the distinction between metaphysics and postmodernism. Let's look at the distinction between remaining a philosopher, a metaphysical philosopher, and a strong poet, in the context of this beautiful line and this beautiful distinction, right? We are doomed to spend, so if we remain a philosopher, if we remain committed to some Platonic metaphysics, or as we will see in a second, some Millsian metaphysics, right? If we do that, we are doomed to spend our conscious lives trying to escape from contingency, rather than, like the strong poet, acknowledging and appropriating contingency. And that is so beautiful. And we can create a very clear juxtaposition of this idea. So let's go back and think about Mill for a second, right? Let's go back and think about Mill, right? And especially chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Mill, and maybe even chapter 3, just all first 3 chapters of Mill, right? But this idea about escaping contingency to discover our true self, right? That is the essence of Mill's entire project, right? And there's this beautiful passage at the end of chapter, not the end, the beginning of chapter 1, right? Where Mill is setting up this argument. Is it 1? Chapter 1? No, it is in chapter 1. And there's this phrase in Mill's On Liberty in chapter 1. He says, it never occurs to anybody that it is an effect of random accident. He uses the word accident. That is the effect of random accident, or in Rorty's language, contingency. Mill writes, it never occurs to anyone, Mill writes, that it is total accident or total contingency where one finds oneself born, right? And Rorty said, and Mill says, it's contingent where we find ourselves, the cultures we find ourselves born into, the families and the socioeconomic groupings and the religious orientation. All of Mill, even Mill says, hey, that's random. It's contingent. It's accidental, right? And he makes some phrase. He says what would have made one a Buddhist in Peking makes one a churchman in London, is the example he gives. Mill does, right? And Mill is pointing to this idea that where we find ourselves, right, is a matter of contingency. Had I been born in Beijing, I would have been a Buddhist on Mill's account. Had I been born in London, I would have been a Christian on Mill's account. Who I am at any given time, or originally where we find ourselves, Mill writes, is contingent. But Mill says, and the whole argument in On Liberty is precisely to escape that contingency and to discover our true what? Our true selves. Beautiful, Jennifer, thank you. Right? And so that's what metaphysics asks us to do. Even Mill, who himself is a metaphysical thinker in very deep ways, because he is committed to this idea that there's an objectively true self, and that there's even something to a kind of rational and progressive orientation. Kind of metaphysics, there's not just a kind, there's a serious metaphysics in Mill. And even though Mill understands that where we find ourselves is contingent, it's kind of accidental, the whole purpose is to escape that contingency, so we can discover the true self, right? And so for metaphysics, the goal is to escape contingency, discover truth. As for postmodernism, then the project becomes recognizing contingency, everything is contingent, and then empowering oneself with a view of language as a series of tools of description, of redescription, that enable us to, in some ways, extract ourselves from one contingency to a poetic creation, to extract ourselves from contingency to poetic creation. And so he says, right? If we remain philosophers, he says, we are doomed to spend our conscious lives trying to escape from contingency, rather than, like the strong poet, acknowledging and appropriating contingency. So for Nietzsche and Rorty, right, one becomes an I. One comes to have meaning and value and purpose that is in some way constitutive of something as an I, when one bears witness to contingency and appropriates, understands. What Rorty means by appropriate means understanding language in a certain way. It's nominalist, it's a human invention, it's an assertion of power, it's a tool of description. Okay, I own that. And now I'm going to take possession of that project. I'm going to become emotionally empowered, creatively energized, and animated in this extraordinarily strong way, like a valoristic way, right? To appropriate that language and use this language to do beautiful, poetic, erotic, private, idiosyncratic things. And specifically, I'm going to give this private life, right? I'm going to write a poem about my private life, about the music I listen to and the books I read and the things I enjoy, and the meaning that is associated with my life, with who I marry and how I make love and what I commit myself to. That's what Rorty ultimately means by not just recognizing that language is contingent, but appropriating it, and appropriating it to do what? Build a self in language. Become a strong poet. We are doomed to spend our lives consciously either trying to escape from contingency, or rather, like the strong poet, acknowledging and appropriating contingency. And then he, on the bottom of 28, moving into 29, he says, therefore, the line, right? The line between weakness and strength, Rorty says, the line between weakness and strength is thus the line between using language which is familiar and universal, and or producing language which, though initially unfamiliar, kind of strange, kind of private, kind of idiosyncratic, which though initially unfamiliar and idiosyncratic, somehow makes tangible the blind impress, the drives and the visions that are inside of us, right? And so the line for Rorty, the line between weakness and strength is one between just using and reusing language that is familiar. It's easy. It's Rorty uses the word weak. It's kind of a laziness for Rorty in this. It's kind of a laziness in Nietzsche for this. It's a kind of weakness, right? To kind of just use and rely on and process and reprocess and rehearse language that is familiar. And by the way, it's familiar because it's the language that has constructed us in a primordial way, right? It's the language we've inherited. It's vocabulary we've inherited. It's the descriptions of important things that we've inherited. And the strength and the difference between kind of weakness and strength, right? The difference between remaining metaphysical and becoming a strong poet is precisely the distinction between using words that are familiar, that have been given to you and are familiar, and finding the emotional strength and the kind of poetic creativity, the intellectual creativity to produce language. Rorty literally says to produce language, or to stylize language, to arc or bend meaning, to use words in new ways, in idiosyncratic ways, to invent new words, to invent new modes of music, new modes of painting, new modes of style. The difference between weakness and strength is using words that are familiar or producing new words, producing new styles, producing new arrangements of words. We can go on and on and on. Producing language which, and this is, and I want to emphasize this, because it sounds like something that is unimportant, but I think this is the most important thing of all the important things, right? This recognition that this process, one, sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's joyous, but it's always difficult. That's what he means by the difference between weakness and strength. Doing this at some time, producing language, right? In stylizing words, producing language, disentangling yourself from familiar things. And by the way, this is a core theme throughout the class. We saw a version of this in Mill. We saw a version of this in Nietzsche. Now we're seeing a version of this in Rorty. It requires a kind of emotional strength, right? It requires one be willing to bear a kind of loneliness, a kind of infamiliarity. Rorty uses the word unfamiliar, right? And things that are unfamiliar, if you are using words that, one, to yourself are unfamiliar, there's a kind of anomie about that. If you're using words that are unfamiliar to other people, there may be moments of a kind of isolation, a kind of loneliness, because people don't understand you, right? And at times that may feel lonely. It may feel like one's isolated. It may feel like one is kind of drifting around. And that is sometimes difficult to bear. You have to learn, we have to learn how to bear that. Can you bear what Rorty calls unfamiliarity? Right? Can you bear just sort of disentangling yourself from the familiarity and what that means in terms of one's emotional being in the world, right? And this is an incredibly important thing, right? And I think that's why it's there. Rorty says, look, strong poets are people who can invent or stylize new words, can learn to describe themselves in new ways, are compelled to do that. But in order to do that, you must go through this. It is a kind of an abyss here. You must go through the unfamiliar. You must walk through the unfamiliar. You must walk through states of enemy, through dislocation, decentralization, the unfamiliar. Right? And I'm fascinated by this because so much of metaphysics is driven towards the familiar, right? Driven towards safety, towards peace, towards stability, right? Oh, to escape the unfamiliar, to escape the unknown. But in order to sort of construct one's own meaning and one's own value, one's own purpose, you have to be prepared to articulate these words of self-description. And you have to be prepared to be unfamiliar to yourself, unfamiliar to others. The difference between weakness and strength. For strength means producing language, which, though initially unfamiliar and idiosyncratic, that's right, there's no escape of that condition, somehow makes tangible, somehow begins to enable you to describe the things you are feeling, the things you have experienced, the story you want to tell, somehow makes tangible, and makes tangible over time and through practice the story you want to tell. And then he goes on, and again, like chapters, he's juxtaposing a metaphysical view and a postmodern view. And this is kind of the brilliance of the book. He's so good at moving through these different perceptions from multiple point of views. And by the way, right, if you think about it, he constantly moves through the chapter juxtaposing these 2 points of view and constantly juxtaposing these 2 points of view from multiple perspectives. And why do you think he's doing that? It's strategic. And by the way, if you think about the whole purpose of the book, as he said in the introduction in chapter 1, he says, great debates in philosophy are never about one side proving inconclusively its point. Never about the debate being settled in some way that constitutes proof. Rorty says that's not how philosophical debates go. It's not how religious debates go. The great debates in philosophy are never resolved around providing proof. They're always resolved, or they're always moved forward by a sort of process by which people try to make how they see the situation or how they see the world look as attractive to other people as possible. Right? And I remember we had a whole lecture on that. We were talking about, how the great debates in philosophy end. And for Rorty, right, they end or they move forward, and maybe they don't ever end, but they move forward when one school of thought is able to make their view on things look attractive to other people. Right? And this is what I mean also when I say Rorty's trying to seduce us into a way of thinking about things. right? How can, rather than trying to prove, right, that this way of thinking about language is true or correct or superior, why don't I try to show you how interesting it is to see things my way, right? What if I try to describe and redescribe my point of view from as many different ways as possible until maybe one of these ways connects with you? Maybe one of these ways of talking about the modern, postmodern, the metaphysical, postmodern debate, maybe there are all these different ways of talking about it, of coming at this. Maybe one of these ways will click with you and you will say, ah, I get it. Now I see what you mean, right? And that's what he's doing throughout the chapter. He's constantly discussing this kind of metaphysical, postmodern notion of language. Does that mean that we escape contingency for something true? Or does it mean we embrace contingency and appropriate it? And then he says, let's talk about it in another way. To put the same point in another way, again, describing problems or debates or issues from as many points of view, redescribing from as many points of view as possible, playing with the language, moving the language around, interpreting words in different ways, all in the hope of making something look as interesting to you as possible. Because if it becomes interesting to you, then there's a greater likelihood that you will adopt it, that you will say, hey, you know what? That's a really interesting way to frame the metaphysical postmodern debate. I hadn't thought about it. That's a really interesting way to frame it. Now I can use it. Now I can see it. And not only can I see it, but now I know what I can do with it. And that's what he's doing throughout the book. It's really brilliant. And he says, to put the same point in another way, he says, top of 29, the Western philosophical tradition, metaphysics, Plato, Kant, Mill, Aristotle, the Western philosophical tradition thinks of a human life as a triumph, a successful, this is Plato, this is what justice was for Plato. This is what Mill means to find an objective truth. Thinks of a human life as a triumph just insofar as it breaks out of the world of time, opinion, and breaks into another world, into the world of enduring truth. Right? So think about it in another way. For metaphysics, a triumphant life is precisely the life that breaks out of the contingency of time and space and accident. And in breaking out and transcending the contingency of time, space, and accident, cultural accident, it discovers the truth. To put it the same point in another way, the Western philosophical tradition thinks of a human life as a triumph, just insofar as it breaks out, it transcends the world of time, appearance, and idiosyncratic opinion. And again, that's Mill. That is precisely what Mill meant when he said freedom is the activation of reason in pursuit of one's objective truth. You break out of the world of time, appearance, and inherited language. And you break out of and you discover what Rorty says here, into the world of enduring truth. Nietzsche, by contrast, he says, thinks the important boundary to cross is not one separating time from atemporal truth, but rather the one which divides the old from the new. Right? So for Nietzsche, for the strong poet, and for Rorty, a triumphant life is measured how one goes from the inherited to the new. how one goes from the given to the idiosyncratic. He thinks, Nietzsche thinks, Rorty thinks, the strong poet lives. He thinks a human life triumphant just insofar as it escapes from inherited descriptions of the contingencies of its existence and finds new descriptions. This is the difference between the will to truth and the will to self-overcoming. This is in Nietzsche's language, this is the difference between the will to truth and the will to power. Rorty calls it the will to self-overcoming. I've overcome what I've been given, what I've been told, who I have been told to be. I've shattered the porcelain doll, and I'm on the way to becoming. To becoming what? To becoming something of my own creative and poetic and idiosyncratic description of my meaning and my value and my purpose. Nietzsche thinks a triumphant life is one that escapes from inherited descriptions of the contingencies of existence. And this difference is the difference between a will to truth and a will to power, or what Rorty calls a will to self-overcoming. It is a difference between thinking of redemption in and through making contact with the truth. I've saved myself, I've redeemed myself because I've escaped contingency and I've found the truth. I'm in coherence with the truth. I'm in correspondence with the truth. Or, as Nietzsche says, thinking of triumph as the process by sort of taking what is inherited and saying, I have created something new. And then in the middle of the page goes on, he says, to see one's life, Rorty writes, to see one's life or the life of one's community as a dramatic narrative, as a poem. To see one's life or the life of one's community as a dramatic narrative is to see it as a process of Nietzschean self-overcoming. Right? And again, critical. And again, this overcoming is both an emotional and a poetic thing. You are constantly in the process of becoming something new. You are constantly in the process of overcoming who you have been. Nietzsche, in Zarathustra, Nietzsche famously called human beings a bridge. They're a bridge. Human beings aren't objective things in some objective truth. They don't have objective natures. They don't have objective meanings. They don't have objective moral values. They don't have objective teleological purposes. People aren't objective things with objective moral truth. They are bridges. They are ways. They are ways. They are movements and ways of becoming, and they are great crossing overs. The bridge is a crossing over an abyss. It's a movement over an abyss. It's a going and a becoming over an abyss. Man is a bridge, not a thing. Man is a way, not the evocation of a moral truth. To see one's life, to see one's community as a dramatic narrative, as a way, as a bridge, always overcoming oneself, reinventing oneself, restylizing oneself. To see one's life, one's community as a dramatic narrative is to see it as a process of Nietzschean overcoming. Life is a way, not a thing. It is a journey, not an objective moral goal. The paradigm of such a narrative is the life of the genius, who can say of the relevant portion of the past, thus I willed it, I created that. Because she has found a way to describe that past which the past never knew. On the bottom of 29, as Rorty starts to transition out of this, he revisits this whole issue of the fear of death. And as we will see on page 41, where we'll end today's discussion, the fear of death that Rorty wants to valorize, or Rorty wants to identify, what is a kind of it's two components of it. One, for strong poets, for people like Nietzsche, and for strong poets, and for people like Rorty, there are two elements to this fear of death. The first one is the realization that as one nears the green light of death, as Larkin said so poetically, is the realization that after a long life, one has remained a replica, that one has remained a porcelain statue, that one never escaped the inherited and the familiar vocabulary. That's the real fear of death isn't that you didn't discover who you are or the truth. The real fear of death is that you remained a replica. You remained always a more or less interesting version of a familiar vocabulary, a familiar set of descriptions about who you are and what you mean and what your value is and who you marry and how you make love and the work you fucking do, right? You remain a replica. You remain a porcelain statue. That's the real fear of death. And the second kind of related element is a kind of realization, an existential realization, that death signifies that you and I will always die with more to write, that the poem remains unfinished. It has to remain unfinished. It has to. And so he says at the bottom of page 29, so the fear, the real fear of death, the fear in which Bloom's poets begin, is the fear that one might end one's days in such a world, in a world one never made, but that one inherited. It is, as Bloom said, the horror of finding oneself or a replica. That's the real fear. For Rorty, the real fear of death is the realization that after a long life, you realize that your life, your ladling list, you discover your horror is in the discovering, the finding of oneself to be only a copy or a replica. The fear in which Bloom's poets begin is the fear that one might end one's day in such a world that one never made, but an inherited world. All right. Now, as the book moves, as the chapter moves from 30 to 34, something really fascinating takes place. And it's caught up again in Rorty's deeper project, his this kind of more imaginative, comprehensive project about language and about how we use language and how we look at writers, right? How we look at different writers. And I just want to remind you of that project so we can set it up. Now, remember, when we were back talking in the introduction, right? And we said, look, Rorty says all metaphysical theories attempt to fuse the public with the private. They attempt to make private fulfillment the meaning of Nick Dungy's life, private fulfillment, private truth, private meaning, the meaning, the deep meaning. They try to make that meaning, the meaning and fulfillment of a life, a private life, compatible with or the same as the political community. What Plato called justice, what Rorty called justice. So they try to fuse the private and the public. Private fulfillment is possible with public belonging, with justice. That's at the heart of all metaphysical theories. And Rorty says in the introduction, we have to delink the private and the public. It is impossible to fuse private meaning and public life in a single comprehensive vocabulary. And he said, one, we can't do that because that's not how language is. Language is it's an invention and it's a tool. And it helps us, and it's a tool to describe things, right? And we have all sorts of different word tools to describe things. And most importantly, Rorty said, we have word tools that we use to help describe and re-describe in this deeply poetic way our private lives. And then we have these word tools that we use to describe open and describe a shared space called politics or community belonging or community association. Now, Rorty said both the private and the public are equally important. We both have private lives and we have public lives, and we're speaking these vocabularies, but the vocabularies are incommensurable. You can't bring them together in a single theory of language because that's not what language is. So he says we got to drop that project. Now, I bore you with this to kind of remind you of that bigger vision, and also because it relates to something he's going to do in a very important way right now. And he says, so not only do we have to see people as possessing private languages and public languages, right? And that these kind of languages, these vocabularies are different because they describe different zones of activity, and they're not commensurable. The private descriptions I have in my life are words that I don't have to defend against anyone. I don't have to justify or explain to you why I listened to The Clash or why I have a tattoo or why I married this person. Those private word tools descriptions they don't have to be defined. They don't have to be justified, unless of course they harm somebody, but that's a different issue. And then the public language is language we use to talk about how we live together. And those tools are definitely open to contestation. That's the whole point. All right. Now, related to that argument, right, when he was talking about literature, he's talking about philosophers, and he says this way of thinking about language to the history of philosophy and the history of literature, because it helps us look at different writers as doing different things, right? It helps us think about different writers as doing different things, right? And so he says, look, some writers, Proust, Nabokov, Nietzsche, right? And he'll say Freud, right? Some writers are really good at helping us cultivate a private language, right? If you read Proust or you read Nietzsche or you read Nabokov, and as we'll see in a second, Freud, think about these writers, not as being true or untrue, one writer better than another. Stop thinking like that. Get that whole way of thinking and creating objective hierarchies. Get all that out of your head. Stop thinking about it in that way. Start thinking about these types of writers as writers who are particularly good at using language, not only to build their own private realities, right? Nietzsche built his secret garden. Proust, 4,000 pages of wallpaper, if you've ever read Remembrance of Things Past, right? And by the way, you should before you die, right? But if you've read Proust, if you've read Nabokov, if you've read Nietzsche, you get the sense that these were writers who became strong poets. And they were really damn good at at description, at language, at stylization, at the whole idiosyncratic, artistic, sensual, erotic project of constructing a life and constructing a meaning and a context. And so some writers are really good at helping us do that. And this is one of the deeper arguments in Rorty's book. This is how Rorty thinks about the history of great writers. Some writers are really damn good at doing certain things. And Proust and Nabokov, now we're going to see Freud as he comes into the argument here, right? Nietzsche, these writers became strong poets. They invented entire realities, right? In and through words, in and through redescribing familiar things in poetic, erotic, sensual, idiosyncratic, dense, unique ways. Right? And Rorty says we read them not only because they did it, we get to experience that joy, but we read them and they help us learn how to do this a little bit on ourselves. They help, by reading Nietzsche, you become inspired to create your secret garden. By reading Proust or by reading Nabokov, you become inspired, right? To think about words in different ways, to stylize meaning, to arc purposes and values. Right? We read them and they help us do this. They help us learn how to become strong poets and learn how to build dense and beautiful and erotic and sensual and meaningful private lives. And then, of course, there are other writers like Marx, and he talks about Dickens, right? There are both philosophers and novelists, people in literature, who are really good at helping us think of the common language we share. Okay, and I kind of bored you with that rehearsal to set this up because Rorty is doing this all the time, right? Rorty, if you've noticed, as Rorty's going through the book, he's talking about very famous and powerful and influential writers throughout the book, throughout the chapters. Here's something from Wittgenstein. Here's something from Nietzsche. Howard Bloom said this about the strong poets. Proust said this, and he's doing this all the time. And what he's doing is he's looking at these very powerful, influential writers, and he's appropriating them. Right? He says, Freud was really good. If we redescribe Freud's project, or he says, let me interpret or redescribe what I think Freud's project is. And let me reinterpret and redescribe it in a way that is very useful, that helps us do really interesting things, right? And he's doing it. He's not only saying what we need to do is describe lots and lots and lots of things in different ways, and certain writers help us to do that. He's doing it in the book. And one of the most important and brilliant ways he does it in the book now takes place in chapter 2. And Rorty says, my goal is to ultimately make Nietzsche amenable to democratic politics, right? To make Nietzsche amenable to democratic politics. How do we make Mill postmodern? But equally as important, how do we bring the power and the evocative vision of Nietzsche, and how do we make that amenable to people, to common people, for lack of a better word? How do we make Nietzsche amenable to democratic politics? How do we democratize Nietzsche? Right? Because one of the problems that we saw with Nietzsche, one of the problems that Rorty has with Nietzsche, right, is that at the end of the day, there's a kind of very deep and very intense kind of aristocratic tendency in Nietzsche, right? There are very few of these people who understand life as a bridge. Right? There are very few of these very emotionally strong, intellectually and poetically open and creative people who are engaged in this process of constant self-overcoming and creativity. right? There, Nietzsche says this is a critical part of the argument, right? This is what distinguishes the aristocrats from the slave morality. The pathos of distance. Remember, Nietzsche said the pathos of distance opens up, right? And Nietzsche was very serious about that. And not only was he serious about it, but there was a sense in Nietzsche that in Nietzsche's view, the strong poet, this poetic aristocrat, this person of constant overcoming, is very rare. It's very difficult. Most people, Nietzsche says, are part of the slave morality. They're happy to be part of the slave morality. So at the end of the day, for Nietzsche, there's a kind of intense elitism in there. There's a kind of intense aristocratic account of the differences between these heroic, strong, tragic poets and the sheep, right? The people of the slave morality, the people of liberal democracy, right? Of egalitarian liberal democracy as a kind of slave morality made political, right? And as we saw when we first started reading Rorty was kind of suspicious of that, right? Rorty was kind of suspicious of that. Not just the kind of aristocratic elitist element of it, but in the desire to empower everybody to become strong poets. Rorty would like to see, Rorty wants to seduce everyone into thinking about consciousness and life as an aesthetic or poetic project, as a dramatic narrative, as he says. And to do that, Rorty is going to adopt, appropriate, and redescribe for his own purposes how he reads Freud. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It's the best part of the book. All right. And so I kind of wanted to stop and set that up so we fully understand what we're about to do and what Rorty wants to do, the kind of the depth and the power of what Rorty wants to do. Remember, some writers are better at helping us become strong poets by helping us think about how we can make poetic and stylize and make idiosyncratic all the ideas and the inspirations and the visions and the impulses that are already happening in our minds and our bodies. So he's going to appropriate Freud and redescribe Freud's purposes. Okay? So let's go to page 34. First paragraph, proper paragraph on 34. In Freud's account, and here, Nietzsche, here's Rorty, right? And by the way, and again, this is a very controversial thing Rorty does, but this is his project, right? Rorty wants us to stop arguing about who objectively understands Freud. He wants us to do two things. Stop thinking of Freud as a metaphysical psychologist, right? Stop debating with ourselves about who got Freud right, who's objectively right in this reading of Freud. All of that way of speaking, that way of viewing is getting in the way of doing interesting things. So Rorty has read Freud. He doesn't think Freud is useful as a metaphysical philosopher. In fact, there are no useful metaphysical philosophers in some way for Rorty. And so he's read Freud, and he's going to interpret and re-describe what he thinks are particularly interesting and creative elements in Freud's thinking. And then he's going to mobilize them in the pursuit of helping us become strong poets. That's the project. And so it's brilliant. And he says, in Freud's account, our unconscious private goals, right, what Freud had called the unconscious, right? Rorty's going to redescribe what the unconscious is, what unconscious fantasy is, what unconscious obsession is. Rorty's going to redescribe that story, to press it into the service of democratic poetry, to sort of democratize the strong poet. In Freud's account, our conscious private goals are as idiosyncratic as individual as the unconscious obsessions and phobias from which they have branched off. Okay, right? Think of Freud's notion of the unconscious as a kind of ultimate sort of reservoir for potential inspiration to be poetic and be creative. Don't think of it as telling you something true about your father or your mother, or something true about adolescent psychological behavior and sexual drives. Fuck that. Don't think of that. Thinking about all of that in that metaphysical language doesn't do us any good, because one, there is no objective sexuality. There is no objective child raising. There's no objective mommy daddy shit. Just let all of that go. Stop thinking of it as some sort of metaphysical account of the truth of human child development or sexuality or shame. Forget the metaphysics. But if we forget the metaphysics, we still have this extraordinary rich literature that we get from Freud about this thing called the unconscious that's stuffed with all these blind impresses, all these influences, all these things that are happening to us. And if we tap into that, if we recognize that and tap into that, we can use all of that as this really intense, private, personal resource to tell extraordinarily beautiful and erotic and unique and idiosyncratic stories. Right? That was just mind-blowing where he just took that. In Freud's account, our unconscious private goals are as idiosyncratic as the unconscious obsessions and phobias from which they have branched off. 10 lines down. Freud, right? Rorty writes, his only utility, Freud's only utility, lies in his ability to turn us away from the universal. So I'm not interested in Freud's desire to be metaphysically true. And I'm not interested in people who want to describe Freud as metaphysically true. I'm tired of talking about things in that way. And I'm going to talk about Freud in a different way. I'm going to redescribe Freud's genius in a way that makes it useful to us, people who want to become strong poets. His only utility lies in his ability to turn us away from universal truths to the concrete, from the attempt to find necessary truths in illimitable beliefs, to search and discover idiosyncratic contingencies of our own individual past, to the blind impress all of our behaviors bear. Freud has provided us with a moral psychology that is compatible with Nietzsche's and Bloom's attempt to see the strong poet as the archetypal human being. So Freud helps us become Nietzschean. Freud helps every person become Nietzsche. Freud democratizes Nietzsche, right? Freud brings Nietzsche to the common person. Right? Because now, rather than just these extraordinarily brilliant, aristocratic, unique, rare artist poets, aristocratic poets running around, dealing with the slave morality and all this insipidity, now we have Freud as a kind of reservoir of all the influences and the blind impresses and the experiences that we've been through, right? And all of this for Rorty, as Rorty redescribes Freud, becomes this reservoir of potential influence that we can use to become poets ourselves. Bottom of 35. What makes Freud more useful and more plausible than Nietzsche? What makes Freud more applicable to all of us? Nietzsche wasn't applicable to the slaves. Nietzsche didn't want to speak to the slaves. What makes Freud more useful and more plausible than Nietzsche, and by the way, right, if you're going to have a postmodern liberal democracy, you're going to have to democratize who? Nietzsche. You can't have a postmodern liberal democracy if you've got this latent vision running around that you've got these strong poets and these slaves. Not possible. So this move for Rorty is necessary. What makes Freud more useful and more plausible than Nietzsche is that he does not relegate the vast majority of humanity to the slave morality. Rorty uses dying animal, but it's a slave morality. What makes Freud more useful and more plausible than Nietzsche is the fact that Freud does not relegate the vast majority of humanity to the slave morality. Freud recognizes that everybody is capable of being a Nietzschean strong poet, democratizes Nietzsche's energy, poetic, creative, robust energy. For Freud's account of the unconscious fantasy, shows us how to see every human life as a poem. Or more exactly, every human life not so racked by pain as to be unable to learn a language. Freud sees every such life. And by the way, Rorty's trying to get us to see our lives like this. This is the point. Freud sees every such life as an attempt to clothe oneself in its own metaphors. As Philip Reif puts it, Freud democratized genius by giving everybody a creative unconscious. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful way to think about the unconscious, the creative unconscious. Inside of you, by virtue of being the kind of being that inherits languages and has all these experiences that are contingent, some are random, some cause pain, some cause joy, by seeing the mind as something that bears all of these impresses, that Freud later called the kind of unconscious, the private unconscious. One to see that as a kind of the mind, as a kind of repository of this, and then to see that as a reservoir for potential self-creation is extraordinary. Freud sees life, every such life, as an attempt to clothe itself in its own metaphor. As Philip Reif puts it, Freud democratized genius by giving everyone a consciousness. Freud showed us that poetry is indigenous. Poetry in the way Nietzsche means it, poetry in the way Rorty means it. Freud showed us that poetry is indigenous to the very constitution of the mind. The mind is a poetic and aesthetic experience. Freud showed us that poetry is indigenous to the very constitution of the mind. He saw the mind as being, in a greater part of its tendency, exactly a poetry-making faculty. Bottom of 36. By seeing every human being as consciously or unconsciously acting out an idiosyncratic fantasy, we can see the distinctively human portion of each human life as the use of symbolic purposes of every particular person, object, situation, event, and the world encountered in later life. Now, I want to read this quickly, and then we'll pick this up. 37 is a critically important page. Seen from this angle, the intellectual is just a special case. Just somebody who does with marks and noises what other people do with their spouses and children, their fellow workers, the tools of their trade. Anything. This is the beauty of it. This is democratizing Freud. For poetic purposes, anything from the sound of a word, through the color of a leaf, to the feel of a piece of skin, as Freud showed us, can serve to dramatize and crystallize a human being's sense of self-identity. For any such thing can play the role in an individual life, which philosophers have thought could, or at least could only be played by universal ideas. Any seemingly random constellation of such things can set the tone for a life. Any such constellation of things, of contingent influences, things in the mind, visions, dreams, fantasy, private obsessions, any such thing can set up and become a reservoir for a kind of poetization of one's life. All right. We're going to say a few more words about this on Thursday, and then we're going to do chapter 3. Love you all very much. Our last lecture will be Thursday, and we'll pick this up on Thursday. We do chapter 3.
Is Thursday the last lecture? Or?
Yep, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good job, you guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Bye, Brian.